Okay, so this just happened a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin. I'll be referring to him again as James, like I have in past stories. For a quick reference, I'm 13 and female. James is 21. James and I were on a road trip from my grandmother's to my aunt's house. I have a great relationship with my cousin, so my parents let me go on trips with him occasionally. It's about a 10-hour drive, and we were about 3 hours into the drive. It was about 9 p.m. at the time. I was pretty sleep deprived, and everything was hilarious at that moment. So when I saw this red semi-truck outside my window, I just laughed my ass off. The man in the truck was heavyset, that's an understatement, and had a long, untamed beard. He had a creepy vibe, but I waved to them. He in turn did a groping motion to me. Finding it more hilarious than creepy, I started laughing harder and told James the story, doing the whole groping motion and all. He looked creeped out and disgusted, but there wasn't anything either of us could do. A while later, about 4.5 hours into our drive, James pulled into our rest stop. I walked into the bathroom, and when I came out, the man was standing there. He looked to be 6 feet at least. I looked out the glass door leading into the building and saw James, glaring daggers at the door. I was confused and walked back to the car. What he told me really creeped me out, so much so I started crying. Then again, I had been awake for around 20 hours. The man had stared and followed me inside to the building, mumbling shit about me. James said he was basically talking normally. He attempted to comfort me, but quickly said he had to go to the bathroom and went inside. A few seconds later, when I was in the car, the guy was at my window. He stared at me, a wide, creepy grin. He started saying I should go with him and he was going to treat me good. He offered me candy and just tried to coax me into his truck. I was busy bawling my eyes out. Then, right on cue, James walks out and yells at the guy and starts threatening him. The guy backed off and got into his truck. He still just stared at me, the grin still on his face. We floored it out of there. We wanted to get as far away from that guy as we could. It was around 12 a.m. when we pulled to a motel to sleep. The rest of the night till 8 a.m. was fine. Nothing really happened. Sadly, that didn't last long. When we were at a restaurant, eating breakfast, the same fat shit sat across from us. He grinned at me, and James just looked pissed off. The guy walked by the table when going to the bathroom and brushed his hand on my shoulder, doing the same on the way back. A quick note, James is a chill dude and will let almost anything slide, but because he's known me since I was just a baby, he's protective over me. He's not like that to even my siblings. He and I are close. He was obviously pissed before, but at that point he stood up from his seat and walked over to the guy's table. He started yelling shit about how he better stop following us and back off of me. He made no threats, but did curse a lot. I felt pretty nervous and I just wanted to go. The guy stood up and smacked James and yelled how I was leading him on. The guy was about 6 feet and James was 6'8". Their argument continued until the cops came and separated it. They got the story and came to the conclusion that because he was assaulted, we could press charges. He said no, and we just continued that day. The rest of the trip was pretty bland. The guy wasn't seen for the rest of it. However, James did follow me like a bodyguard whenever and wherever we went. Even though he was protecting me, I was terrified. He looked scary as shit, but he's a cinnamon roll. Also, on the trip, I tried to ask him about what happened when I was 7. It was another story I posted before, and he just played dumb. Bitch boy wouldn't tell me shit. Anyway, hope you all enjoy reading this shit show. Preface. I'm a 23-year-old woman, and I am half Cherokee from Georgia, USA. At the time that this story took place, my fiance and I were living on a large farm in Maryland. We didn't use the farm, but we were renting a small house in the property, and we were free to come and go around the grounds. I was only 19 at the time this took place, and the only residents in our home were myself, my fiance, and our cat and dog. Our cat was a lunatic barn cat that I had rescued because I can't say no to animals that need help. And on our day was my loyal pit bull, who is a sweet, cuddly, scaredy cat. She weighed about 75 pounds and is afraid of her own shadow. Our farm was situated on about 20 acres of land, and our driveway was about half a mile long. So usually when I would get home from work, my loyal dog and I would go for a walk, and usually I brought my fiance with me. Not that I was afraid to go out alone, just that he spends too much time playing games. After our driveway was a 12-mile long road through woods and farms until it finally reconnected with civilization, so it was safe to say that we were far, far from other people, except for our landlord, of course. The first miles was through open farmland, followed by a brief patch of forest, and then about a half mile of wheat fields, and then solid forest for 2 more miles. Now that you have a bit of the layout, on to the really creepy bit. So it started off like any other weekday evening. My fiance and I returned home from work to our happy cottage and happy pets. Harley, our dog, was frantic to go for a walk, so I quieted her and changed into walking clothes and asked my fiance if he would join me. He had gotten home shortly after me and said he had seen one of the coyotes that we have around close to the fields by our house. But as you know, coyotes are mostly scavengers, especially out here on the East Coast, so I wasn't too worried, and I'm very capable of defending myself. I called him a puss and then told Harley that we could go and that we would be fine without him. Laughing to myself, we left the cottage and started walking toward the driveway. The sun was going down, and the October air had started to get a chill to it, and it rustled through the cornfields next to our long driveway. The corn was about 6 feet tall at this point in the year, and impossible to see through, so I assumed that my fiance was just trying to scare me, because there was no way he could have seen a coyote in this field. Harley was enjoying her time in the field, tearing in and out of the corn stalks on our walk up the driveway, and I knew that with as big of a coward as she was, that she would alert me to any danger very quickly and by running away. By the time I reached the end of the driveway, the sun had set and the moon, which had already come out, was shining high above the fields. It wasn't quite full, but it provided enough light that I didn't need to use the flashlight or Harley's collar light. We turned left down the road and proceeded across the first section of the field. The first field was soybeans, and if you don't know, they are relatively short plants that nothing but a rabbit could hide in, and off in the distance, I spotted a few deer, but nothing alarming. So we relaxed and enjoyed our walk through the night air. I threw a stick and Harley brought it back over and over again. Typical dog and owner stuff. We reached the first small section of trees, and Harley stopped and bumped into my leg, letting me know that there was something ahead. It wasn't a coyote or a deer, but there was a rabbit that had been hit by a passing car and was still struggling. As much as I hate to say this, there was no way it was going to live, and honestly it's probably what drew the coyote pack in. I knelt down by it, and using my knife quickly put it out of its misery, as my family had taught me, and let it pass into the next life. Feeling sad but somewhat relieved that all we had encountered was a handful of deer and that poor rabbit, we continued our walk and passed into the next field. This was a wheat field, and the wheat was about ready for harvest, so it was quite tall and hard to see through. The field was quiet though, and Harley didn't do anything, so I figured that the coyotes had passed on if there had been any there at all. Now this is the part you have been waiting for, and I don't know what it was, but here it is. We rounded the corner of the field and into an area with wheat in our left and forest in our right, and the air seemed to go still. Harley got closer to me, and I heard rustling in the wheat field. I saw 3 tails circling back toward the forest. Coyotes. The eastern coyotes are small, but in a pack they get pretty ballsy. Harley raised her heckles and I yelled, "Get out of here, go on, F off," as loud as I could, and the coyotes, startled, scattered off into the trees. I decided to turn around and get out of there before they decided to regroup, because I am brave, but I'm not going to walk into a darkened forest with a coyote pack and a cowardly pit bull. We turned to go backwards, and again I heard a rustling in the wheat. A confused coyote? I thought it must be, but no. Harley was standing stock, still staring at the wheat, and I whistled for her to come with me. The high-pitched, ears-piercing, two-fingered whistle. That snapped her out of it for a second when my whistle was returned from inside the wheat. All of a sudden, all of the family legends I had heard came flooding back to me, and I expected to see a tall, thin creature emerge, but nothing did. I didn't smell rotting meat or feel a sense of dread. Instead, I was transfixed with fear and curiosity. I whistled again. The whistle was returned. It was very human sounding, but at the same time not. Against my better judgment, I said, "Hello?" My own voice replied, "Hello." My hand on my knife, I said, "Show yourself." Silence. No bugs. No coyotes. No Harley noises. Just my own breath. Slowly, the rustling started again, and I turned on my flashlight. I shined it on the wheat field, and what I saw confuses me to this day. Animal eyes. That green-yellow reflection of light was cast back at me, but what it was connected to didn't make sense. There was a girl, no more than 14 or 16, crouched in the wheat. She wore what I think must have been some kind of deerskin or fur, and she was naked otherwise. She was very thin and looked as though her skin had never seen sunlight. Her hair was long and tangled with wheaten leaves. Under any other circumstances, I would have said she was beautiful, but at that moment she was terrifying. We stared at each other for what must have been a solid minute or so, but felt like much longer, until I heard the unmistakable coyote howl from the forest. Both of our heads snapped toward the noise, and immediately I heard her take off through the wheat toward the sound. At that same moment, Harley took off toward our house, and I went after her. We didn't stop running until we got to the driveway, and I stopped not wanting my fiancé to know I was running away from something. I could still hear the howling in the distance, and we started walking at a brisk pace. We made it back to the cottage with no further problems, and I didn't tell my fiancée about it, not wanting to go out with the gun. She hadn't hurt me, so I didn't think it right to hunt her. I was awoken in the middle of the night that night by the sound of the coyotes outside our cottage. This wasn't usual, but now I wondered if she was with them. When I was coming home from work about a month later, I had stopped obsessing from that night, and I almost thought I had imagined it. When I had to slam on my brakes for something in the road, it was dark, and when my headlights hit it, its eyes reflected green and yellow. It was a large coyote. It just stared at my car for a moment and ran off into the woods. I know this sounds crazy, but I still wonder if that was her. I grew up a skeptic. In fact, in my senior year of high school, this weird girl in my English class told a story to the whole class about how she moved into a house once and the Scrabble game she had spilled onto the floor and spelled "get out" or some shit, and my teacher gave her a look as if to say, "This bitch." I let out a legitimate sneeze, but ever the sucker for a well-timed joke, I said, "Oh, sorry guys, I'm allergic to bullshit," just loud enough to where my friends could hear. They got some laughs. Fast forward a whole year, I was in college during the day and I worked at McDonald's during the night. I worked for a small franchise. If you don't know how that works, essentially a franchise owner makes their own executive decisions while adhering to basic guidelines that McDonald's establishes and gives the franchise owners permission to use their brand. Anyway, one of the liberties my owner at the time took was she had her stores close at 1 a.m. instead of staying open 24 hours a day like most locations. During the summer of 2013, however, she opted to try keeping us open overnight and into the morning. Aside from seriously pissing me and the girls off, since nobody wanted this closing shift, it was me and like 4 girls who cycled throughout the week so we could all get 2 days off a week. It wasn't too terrible. Because the store closed at 1 a.m. and we'd typically be out of there by 1:30 a.m., the store was usually empty from that time until about 4 a.m. when the morning crew would come in. We were in a gas station, one of those half gas stations, half restaurants, and at 11 p.m. we would lock the only exterior entrance to the dining room, and we would close the gate, which, apart from being unnecessarily noisy, was the only other way to get into the restaurant from the convenience store we shared a building with, but the drive-thru would remain open until closing. It was a good system. It worked for everyone. When we switched to being a 24-hour location, the dining room still closed at 11 p.m., but the drive-thru would remain open. The layout of the store was such that you could see all the way to the back of the kitchen from the dining room and all the way into the dining room from the kitchen. In other words, there was nothing people on the other side of the counter couldn't see. On the first night, not being used to the schedule, it was quite hectic and we were really slammed, but that was the only night with that issue. Every night after that, everything was dead. This did afford us some time to clean things we wouldn't ordinarily do, however. One night, about a week after the new schedule went into effect, I found myself cleaning the notorious shake machine when I heard a noise and turned around. What I saw walking the length of the counter on the customer side was the form of a human, from the mid-thigh up, except it was all black, like a walking shadow. It walked from the side of the counter by the outside door, which remember was locked, to the other end of the counter where there was a space between it and the wall for employees to come back. That's also the end of the counter with the gate which, as I mentioned before, was shut and locked, and if you touched it, it would rattle very loudly. I was certain my eyes deceived me, so I went out to the dining room and I checked the door, which was certainly locked as it was about 3 a.m. I figured it was my imagination. Then the next night it happened. I was further back in the kitchen, cleaning the grill, breaking down the grill for you former McDonald's employees, and turned to my left to grab a brush, and I saw the exact same thing as the night before, and my blood ran cold, as it is doing as I write this, but I still didn't say anything, thinking it was just my imagination. I had the next 2 nights off, and the night I came back, it was my turn to do dishes, and one of the girls' turn to do the grill, which I was grateful for because I honestly hated that nasty-ass grill, making me all sweaty and greasy and burning me. I was scrubbing a dirty spatula or something, and then I heard something behind me, so I looked, and I see the girl there looking in the direction of the front, but otherwise motionless, and I noticed the time was around 3:15 a.m. I knew what she saw, so after a minute of watching her stand there with her back to me, motionless and staring at the front, I said, "Tell me what you just saw." And she explained, in detail, the exact thing I had seen my 2 previous shifts. I said something to the effect of, "So now you've seen it too," or something, and she got creeped out. I knew then what I had seen was a ghost. We decided not to tell any of the others so they, A, wouldn't think we were crazy, and B, on the off chance they believed us, we didn't want to freak them out. This strategy didn't keep a lid on things for too long though, because the very next night I was working with another one of the girls who saw it and immediately freaked out, causing our manager to come out of the office and ask what had happened. Before she could get out the whole story, the manager stopped her and said, "Oh, that's just George." Admittingly, I don't remember the name, so we'll just say George. And both the girl and I looked at her, and obviously she understood we wanted her to elaborate. She explained that when she started, a few years before this took place, she knew an employee who knew someone from when they started years prior, who worked there when the store opened some 20 years ago. She said she didn't know the details, but an employee died somehow, and weird stuff started happening soon afterward. This was something we lived with nightly for a few months, something we'd remarked that we saw it, other times not. We would tell any new manager. Some had seen it themselves, some had only heard of it. Some believed it, and others didn't. But we never told new employees about it. We didn't want them to get scared or think we were hazing them. I began dating a manager there, which was a no-no, so I was getting transferred to another store down the road within the franchise. About 3 or 4 days before I was due to transfer, it dawned on me that one of the morning ladies had worked there since it opened. So one morning when she came in, we all stayed after our shifts were over to talk to her on her first break. It was a payday, so we were going to wait for the store manager to pick up the paychecks and bring them in about 5 a.m. anyways. There were 3 or 4 of us, including this woman, sitting in the break room. I was sitting at the large round table, and the others were sitting on the bench against the wall, nowhere near the table. We decided to tell her about what we had been experiencing, and she immediately finished our own thoughts by telling us what we were about to say, describing it in perfect detail. She went on to tell us that there was a guy in his mid-20s, back about a year after the store was built, who was very troubled and killed himself in a very violent manner involving a propane explosion in his car. At the time the story takes place, there was a large bound journal with a page or two for every day off of the year. It was the responsibility of the staff to write their day off requests in advance in this book, which her manager would refer to when making the week's schedule. That book was the only thing sitting on that table when I was sitting at, and remember, there was no one else near this table. Well, when I found out the way he died, even the jokester, remember the beginning of the story, I made some smart remark that I don't remember that was less than sensitive about the guy, and no sooner did the words leave my mouth than that big book flew off the table as if I had pushed it. We all got up and got the hell out of there. I didn't pick up my check until 3 days later, which was my next and, by coincidence, my last shift there. My name is Matthew Calamane, and I am the writer and director of the feature film titled The Grin, a story that is based on true events that actually happened on the set where it was filmed, or otherwise known as my house from childhood. I found myself at home one weekend night. My parents were out of town, and I was returning from a cancelled sleepover at a friend's house. The lights were on when I got in the door, and I remember getting a phone call from that same friend shortly thereafter, which would end up being the last normal event of the night. My brother was playing video games in the next room, and I could hear him tapping furiously at a video game while I spoke on the cordless phone. I walked around in the living room and ended the phone call in the kitchen when I remember hearing some kind of high-pitched squeal that came from the house somewhere, and I couldn't place where it was coming from, as it sounded the same in every room I went to investigate. It ended after about a minute after it started and was interrupted by the phone ringing, but the phone was not in the kitchen where I left it. It was in the bathroom on the counter in front of the sink. I answered the phone and there was no one there, so I hung up. It was at that point where I heard a dragging sound, like a large heavy object being dragged in the attic crawl space above me. I followed the sound as it was slowly navigated from room to room and ended up in my parents' bedroom, who still had a waterbed. After the sound made it to the far wall, it stopped and the phone rang again. This time my friend was on the other end of it. I told him what was going on and he told me to be careful and call the police. After I got off the phone, I laid down on the waterbed and was horrified to find a body-shaped solid object inside the waterbed mattress and leaped out. I then heard a knock at the door and answered it quickly, but there was nobody there. It was at this point where my brother called me from his room to check something out, and he had just discovered in the game he was playing something, and a little more than annoyed at his lack of interest in what was going on, I stormed into his room. There was nobody there. His bed was made, and the room was spotless. Neither the console nor the TV was on, and the controller was wrapped and unplugged. There was no way he could have hid and cleaned his room in the few seconds it took me to make it from the front door to his room. I had been alone the entire night, hearing for 20 straight minutes my brother playing a game that he was not present to be playing. The phone rang again, but again, it was not where I left it. This time it was resting on the kitchen counter where I originally had left it, so I walked through the entire house to answer it. It was my friend calling again, this time saying that the call was dropped for some reason, and he was calling me back. I explained what just happened, and there was another knock at the door. Since I was standing right next to it, I peeked out the window within 2 seconds of the knocks, and there was no one there. At this point, I opened the door and stepped onto the porch to make sure I didn't see anyone running away, as I had a large wide open yard and there wasn't anything to hide behind. I walked into the yard to look around, but didn't find anything. I found myself engaged in several more minutes of talking before my friend got off the line, and it was at that moment where I realized that the place I had been staring off into space while talking, there were two very large black reflective eyes looking back at me. The figure was tall and lanky and stood only 10 feet or so from me, in the shadows cast by the front of the garage from the front door light. The most notable feature he wore was an inhumanly large smile, and he was grinning with oily metallic teeth from literally ear to ear. Despite me staring directly at him for more than 5 minutes, I pretended I did not notice him, and through willpower alone, made it inside the house without running as fast as I could, and instead walked calmly. I remember feeling like if I ran, he would chase me, and somehow knew that he would have caught me easily. I barricaded myself in my room for the rest of the night, and did not fall asleep until the sun came up the next morning and my parents were home. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before, and nothing like that has happened since. Okay, so I don't really know how to start the story off, but it just happened like an hour ago, and I'm still spooked. So, a bit of a preface. Me and my friend are home alone right now, and have been for a few hours. Every time he comes over, we go to the woods by my house, and it's normally uneventful, with some throwing rocks and breaking trees and stuff. Harmless fun. But this time, something else happened. Like I said, we're home alone and have been for a while, and while this happened, we were obviously home alone. We went outside to go to the woods, and the trip there was uneventful, but once we got there, something was off. Everything was dark, tons of trees had been knocked down, and the entire place was not like I remembered it being. We kept going in, still having our usual harmless fun, and at one point, my friend turned to me and said we should go back. I looked at my phone and decided it had only been 30 minutes, so we might as well stay longer, cause it'll be a few hours until anyone would want us to be home. We continued on, finding a few strange things, like an old crushed Mountain Dew can, probably 10 to 20 years old, and a toy boat which had been completely destroyed by the wind and water and other things, and was probably even older than the can. Our plan was to go further than I had ever been into the woods, which isn't really hard for us, because I've barely been that deep. After walking for a while, we came to a landmark I knew of that marked about the deepest I've ever been. A while ago, when I was going far in, I came upon a bridge built on a log that fell over a river in the middle of the woods. However, one thing was different. There was something sitting on top of it. Whatever was on it was small and resembled the head of an animal. When we got closer and got a good view of it, it was a deer skull, pearly white and clean, sitting on the bridge, with no clue as to who put it there and where the rest of it was. Behind the river, there was a huge hill with a creepy small house on it. While we were looking around, I heard a creak or some other high-pitched noise from up towards it. Freaked out, we began to run, and from behind me I hear my friend scream, and I hear him running behind me. We both keep running, and once we reach the edge of the woods, we step onto the road. I asked him why he screamed, and he said he heard footsteps next to him. We quickly made our way home, and when we got there, the garage door was open. Not knowing if it was left open or not, we ran inside, locking the door, checking the house, and turning the alarm on. Now we're sitting here, and by the time I finish this, it's nearly 2 hours since, and I still can't shake the fear of that eerie woods behind me. And if you would like more evidence that this happened, just ask my friend.